We're going to now spend the next 40 or so minutes going right into the future. And it's interesting because the module I'm going to go through with you right now can sometimes take a full day, and it's going to cover several decades worth of information in terms of what's coming. So I'm a futurist, which is a really fancy way of saying that I study the future and I track trends. It is a rigorous art in terms of what we do. There are no fancy bells and whistles. There are no contemporary technological algorithms which underpin what we do in our shop. We just do a lot of disciplined reading and analysis. And we have 4 particular criteria we use as far as what we decide we need to pay attention to. A few years ago, people started coming up to us and not asking us what was going to happen in the future, but based on our track record, and this is something that made us very happy, they started asking us, how is it that you're always getting it right? Or what does your shop do to really understand where trends are going so accurately? And this was a very interesting question. The reason why this was an interesting question is because it caused us to become more introspective about how we do our work. And it became something that eventually was prescriptive for how we help others look into the future as well. So we identified over a dozen what we call thinking technologies. And these are techniques that we practice very routinely to look objectively into the future. And I'm just going to cover one of those with you today as a takeaway framework for you and everyone you work with to look at the future differently so you're better prepared. And then once we have that principle down here today, I'm going to take you on a crash course into where exactly the future is going. Before we do that, I would just like to say that another component of my job, which is very interesting, is that I actually work on a day-to-day basis with both my wife and my mother. Every guy's dream. Guys in the audience, for all the men in the audience out there, yell if you really, really, really would, in a perfect world, work with both your wife and your mother. Silence. Oh, I heard one. I can't see you, but we have to talk after this. I can give you some pointers. And my wife is here in the audience somewhere, my beautiful wife and colleague. Hey, honey. So let's talk about where the future is going. And before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what we don't do to examine the future. You'd be surprised. There are actually smart people, people who are heads of research, strategy, marketing, at some of our client organizations that have come up to us in the past and asked us if we look into a crystal ball. Obviously, we do not. Do we read tea leaves? No, I hate to disappoint you. We don't do that either. Do we read palms? No, we've tried to do that before, but haven't met with much success. And do we use a Ouija board? Unfortunately, no. But again, what we do is we use these disciplined thinking technologies. The one I want to cover with you today, which is the mother of all thinking technologies. It is the most important one to take with you. And I hope that all of you fundamentally understand this. It is what we call the recognition of educated incapacity. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is. The definition of educated incapacity is as follows. It's knowing so much about what you know that you are the last to see the future of your area of expertise, irrespective of what area of expertise or industry that is, differently. So what do I mean by this? This is exactly why you would not necessarily go to lawyers to understand the future of where the legal profession was going. You wouldn't go to doctors to necessarily understand where the future of medicine was going. You wouldn't go to army generals to understand the future of warfare. And you really wouldn't always go to economists to understand where the economy was moving. And we read about a study a few years ago. It was a longitudinal study that tracked the ability of trained professional certified economists to be able to predict future market movements versus, everyday people, average Joes like me or you. And the study realized, it found out in its results that average people were about as skilled at predicting future market movements as trained economists, which is a great example of this. And everyone suffers from this, including market researchers and all of you in this room, and it is not a knock on you because I suffer from this and we all do. So the trick is, how do we get around this educated incapacity? If you think about our lives, you were born to certain parents, you grew up in a certain neighborhood, you went to certain schools, you had certain teachers. You ended up going, if you did go, to a certain college or university, and maybe going farther than that, you had certain professors, and then you went into the world of work and you had a certain job at a certain company with certain bosses. And all along the way, you are accumulating knowledge. And that has become your biggest asset. That is what makes you who you are today. That's why you're here at this conference. You are experts in your field because of everything I just described. And I'm not going to use the word baggage because that has a negative connotation. Let's consider that your luggage. You have worked very hard to be able to afford and accumulate this designer luggage a 10-piece set of Louis Vuitton or Gucci luggage. That's what you have, and that is your greatest asset, but it is also your greatest liability. Because what you have worked so hard to develop and build and accumulate is also what you work the hardest to protect. So when a disruptive future comes along, this is what differentiates people who are truly proactive and are ready to move into the future against those who are truly reactive and do not want to embrace change and want to protect the status quo. So we all suffer from this. Now, in our shop, we did a lot of heavy lifting and thinking on this, and we could only think of 2 living, thinking creatures that don't suffer from educated incapacity. 1, little children. So again, I'm just going to ask, you guys yell if you're familiar with anything I ask you about. How many of you are familiar with the current AT&T advertising campaign? It's not complicated, with the guy who's sitting in a classroom and he's asking questions of little kids and he solicits their responses. Yeah, pretty much universal, right? That's what I thought. That's all over the place. And it's a great campaign. But at the core of it, what is that campaign all about? It's about the fact that if you ask a child a question, it could be about something simple, it could be about something complex. They're going to give you a very objective response because they are not colored by any of the life experiences, that any of us in this room might have our opinions about that issue colored by. It ties together very nicely with Jeremy Sachs' presentation just now on stereotypes. And Bill Cosby had his comedy routine for all those years about kids say the darndest things, and it was hysterical, but it was also true to life. The second living, thinking creature that doesn't suffer from this objectivity, that doesn't suffer from this lack of objectivity, are aliens from another planet. So we came across a cartoon a few years ago that we thought was really cute, but it actually had a deeper meaning to us. And 2 aliens had been brought down in their mothership to Earth, and they were tasked with studying Earthlings and sending a report back about basically what's life on Earth like. So they studied Earthlings for a couple of weeks and they wrote their report, and the report basically read as follows. The Earth is inhabited by 4-legged creatures, called automobiles. Each one has at least one 2-legged slave called a human being. In the morning, a really loud, obnoxious noise goes off to wake up the human being, who then goes and takes the automobile to a social club called a parking lot where it hangs out with other automobiles all day, while the human goes into a building to earn an income to support the automobile. And this goes on and on and on. And it makes people chuckle, and it made us chuckle. But ultimately, what it made us think about was if you were to come into a situation completely objectively, your perspective on what's actually happening might be entirely different. If you think about very practical examples on Earth here today, if an alien landed from another planet and went into a retail store, it would look at how pants were arranged, or jeans. And it would see that the smallest sizes are up near the ceiling and the largest sizes are down on the floor. Now, does that make any sense? The smaller you are, you need help with a ladder to get to your size, and the biggest, tallest people have to squat all the way down to the floor to get their size. It makes no sense. But because we have spent most of our lives in a society where that's the norm, we've never thought to question it. We don't see it objectively. It doesn't even dawn on us. An alien that comes down from another planet asks all of you in this audience, where did you buy your pants? And most of you, because we've done this poll with groups before, would say that you bought it in a store. And the reason why you bought it in a store, even with all of the other distribution channels that are out there now, is because you wanted to try it on and make sure it fit. So the alien is thinking, well, okay, then I'm picturing a store as a place where the majority of the real estate is devoted to a fitting room, where people can go in and actually try on garments, because this is why people go to stores. And the alien walks into a store, and what does it see? It sees a fitting room is a tiny little cubicle or a closet all the way in the back corner. It's never cleaned. It's serviced with zero technology. And the alien is thinking this is exactly counterintuitive to what should be happening here on Earth. An alien looks at a dollar bill here in the United States, and it sees an Egyptian pyramid. And it says, why is this on currency? And it's the sort of thing that every one of us in this room, even though there are some of you that probably believe we're going to go to a cashless future, we hold dozens, hundreds of dollar bills over the course of a month. And no one ever thinks to say, why is there an Egyptian pyramid on our money? Think about how an alien would look at the most mundane, everyday things differently than we do. So it's using alien eyes to remove educated incapacity and see the future objectively. Now, we talk about this to a lot of audiences, and one of the first responses we get is, that sounds great, but is that achievable? There are such simple techniques that you can use to achieve this kind of objectivity. One of them, for example, is go out of your comfort zone and subscribe to digital or print publications that are about topics that are completely foreign or alien to you, or the opposite of what you're interested in. If you are into sports like I am, subscribe to a gardening publication. If you're into gardening, subscribe to a NASCAR publication. If you're liberal, pay more attention to what's going on in the conservative media, and if you're conservative, pay more attention to what's going on in the liberal media. There's been research out there that indicates that people self-select into social networks. So when you're on Facebook and you see dozens of people commenting in your news feed, those are people that you have self-selected as friends or colleagues who you've decided to become more connected to, and ultimately they share your values, certainly politically, more often than not. So a lot of people, even if they think they're objective, are not actually opening their minds to different points of view, and doing that is exactly what allows you to achieve alien eyes. So I want all of you to leave here today with this technique in your pocket, in your toolkit. And now knowing that, we're going to do a crash course real quick into where the future is going. So again, I'm going to ask everyone in the room to yell. How many of you are baseball fans? Yeah, that was a very baritone response on that one. I'm not surprised. I'm a huge baseball fan. And if you couldn't tell by my accent, I'm also from New York, and I hate the Yankees. I absolutely despise the Yankees. Yeah. Now, there we go. There's a universal response, you know, the evil empire. So I'm a big Mets fan. It's not something I readily admit. But I do like to use this quote from Yogi Berra, who is a fantastic Hall of Fame catcher from the New York Yankees, and he's known for his pearls of wisdom over the years. One of my favorites is, if you reach the fork in the road, take it. Very profound. I really like this right here. The future ain't what it used to be. And this is one of those things that he said, which sounded silly at the time, but it's really prescient. And the reason why is because the future is changing rapidly now. The pace of technological change is so disruptive that the way the future looks today is different than it looked yesterday, will be different from the way it looks tomorrow. So we have to figure out a way to contextualize all of this change and where the future is going. So in our shop, we have a framework we call the evolution of economies. Now, that's not language that we invented. There are a lot of analysts out there and thinkers who use the evolution of economies framework. It helps describe how we, as humankind, move from hunter-gatherer through the agricultural revolution, through the industrial revolution, into the post-industrial economy after World War II, and then in the 90s into what we called in our shop the immotile economy, and others out there were calling it the service economy, the knowledge economy, the information economy. And basically, if you think about this, we had identified a couple of things. Number one, even though society profoundly changes, each new economy layers on top of the old ones. So what do I mean by that? Today in the United States, only 2 to 3% of our active workforce, human workforce, is directly employed in agriculture. So we are no longer an agricultural society by any means. But agriculture is still a critical underpinning to our economy. So we still are an agricultural economy. But we are also an industrial one, a post-industrial one, so on and so forth. Every time one of these transitions takes place, it is for a very fundamental reason. A confluence of several very disruptive technologies emerges. And what it does is it displaces a lot of human labor from things that used to be done a certain way. It creates new efficiencies in how those things are done, so now everything is done more efficiently, and all the people who were laid off from previous industries or previous jobs eventually are reabsorbed into the workforce doing new things because entirely new industries and vistas are opened up. Now, what we see today is a situation where for the first time in this process, many analysts, including us, are not sure whether or not the workforce, the traditional workforce that is, let me back up, the traditional workforce is going to catch up with the pace of technological change, whether or not people will actually all be reemployed and reabsorbed into the workforce as they have through all of these previous transitions. So that means that the future of work could look very non-traditional. So in the 90s, we looked at this and we made a third observation, and it's the most fundamental of all, and that is that there is a compression of time between these changes. So we were in the agricultural era for thousands of years. Then the industrial era, and then less than 200 years later, we had the post-industrial. 50 years later, we went into the immotile. And we said in the early 90s that about 25 years later, because of this compression of time, we were going to go into a new economy. So we predicted that around between 2005 and 2010, we were going to see a huge disruption again. So in around 2007, when what everyone likes to call the Great Recession hit, we actually looked at that and said, this is not a Great Recession. This is a fundamental transformation. We viewed it entirely differently than all of the economists out there. Because what we saw, yes, there was some jiggering going on in the financial markets. We obviously had the mortgage crisis. There were things happening, derivatives and all of the other related issues that were, people fudging with the financial markets. That was all part of something bigger. And a lot of that was underpinned by advanced technology that allowed it to happen. We said that this was the fundamental transformation of the economy to a new economy. So we basically had to ask ourselves 3 questions, and we looked at our last 5 years' worth of information and trend data to answer these 3 questions. Number 1, where are jobs being created? Number 2, where is disposable income going? And number 3, what is the modus operandi, or the MO, of the emerging economy? So in reverse engineering those 3 questions, we answered the third one first, and this is a little heavy, but we realized that the new economy was going to be all about altered dimensionality, and that dimension is space. And that sounds very heavy, I realize that, but what we did was we then answered the first 2 questions: where is disposable income going and where are jobs being created? And that led us to the identification of 10 very concrete growth areas of the future, all of which, as it says here, will serve to influence, shape, and inform research and insights along with everything else. Now understand, I'm going to walk you through very quickly these 10 growth areas. They're not in any particular order of priority or importance, although I front-loaded them with a few that I think might have, at least intuitively to all of you, a more direct application into what you do on a day-to-day basis. So here's number 1. I'm going to ask a question of all of you. If we think about a luxury in very general economic terms as something which is in very high demand but very short supply, think about what the number 1 luxury in all of your lives is today. What do you not have enough of, but you need more of? Just shout it out. Time. Oh, you guys are beautiful. Okay. Every once in a while, someone says money, and every once in a while, someone gets really cute and yells out sex, especially in a dark room like this because no one can identify who they are. I would never say such a thing again. My wife is in the front row over here. So, time. Time is universal. It doesn't matter what industry you're talking to, what event you're at. It doesn't matter how senior the people are that you're talking to. Basically, everyone says time. Time is the number 1 luxury value proposition today, and it is arguably the number 1 value proposition overall, no matter what you do. So this first growth area is what we call time space. So let me go through a couple of sub-areas within time space that I think are really critical for you all to understand. Number 1, we are moving away from a traditional notion of time as linear to the way that time is understood by quantum physicists as cyclical. So more pragmatically, thinking about what all of you do, time is no longer sequential, it is simultaneous. What do I mean by that? It used to be that someone lived their life, they went through their life day by day by day, and it was a very linear sequential process. But now, you can have your life in the real world, and you can also have one or multiple lives in virtual worlds. I know that there are firms represented here in this room that are doing really cutting-edge research using virtual reality technology, and some of it was actually just discussed in Jeremy Sachs' presentation. So virtual reality is becoming mainstream. And Jane McGonigal talked about massively multiplayer online gaming platforms, whether it's World of Warcraft or other similar platforms like that. These are all virtual worlds, Second Life. People have avatars and alter egos and personalities in these worlds. They're living multiple identities at once. So time is becoming simultaneous, not sequential. There's also something in our shop that we call the nonlinear life trajectory. And this is critical for any of you in the room who do market research or study demographics. The nonlinear life trajectory is all about the fact that what we once understood as the way that people progress through life no longer applies. So let me give you 4 or 5 concrete examples of that. Number 1, yell out if you're familiar with the term, I'm sure most of you are, the Boomerang Generation. Okay. Not necessarily the most flattering term for people who fall within that, and if any of you in this room are part of the Boomerang Generation, I apologize. But the Boomerang Generation is a way to encapsulate adults, grown men and women, generally younger adults, but it could be, even people who are well entrenched into Gen X, who have moved back and lived at home, either because they can't find a job, they don't want to find a job, in many cases they have a job but want to save money. So they go back and they live with their parents, and there are millions of these people. And this represents a complete break from what we originally understood as the paradigm for sort of sequential and linear life trajectory. We think about the fact that many more women now are delaying childbirth and marriage because they're putting a premium on their careers. And that's changing the ballgame a lot. We think about the fact that a lot of boomers, the front end of boomers turned 67 years old this year. And everyone talks about this huge market of aging boomers that are coming along and what that's going to do to the retirement market and all of the products and services that have to be tailored towards them. Well, fortunately for boomers, their life expectancy is going up and up and up. In fact, 1 in 10 boomers is expected to live to be over 100 years old. Unfortunately for them, because of that, they now can't ride off into the sunset at 55 or 65 years old and hope that they can live off of their savings for another few years and have it all be hunky-dory. In many cases, they don't have the finances to do that, so they're forced to go back into work, or they know they're going to get bored for 30 to 35 years and are starting businesses and doing things that they've always wanted to do and now have the freedom to do. So it's not like people are retiring and just fading into the sunset. This is a very complex group. And as market researchers, many of you are still guilty of breaking down age demographics into 18 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59 maybe, and then it's pretty much 60 or 65 and up. And you're taking this huge cohort and you're lumping them all together when the nuances between them are really, really stark. The same thing happens with the youth population. If we think about it, we have these generational divides. We have boomers, and then we have Gen X, and then we have Gen Y or millennials. So I was born in 1979, so by most accepted market research standards, I'm considered the very end of Gen X. My wife, Erica, was born in 1981. She's considered Gen Y. The ridiculous thing to me, the counterintuitive thing to me, is that with the pace of technological change, it's almost crazy to lump Erica in with someone who was born in about 1989, 1990. She and I have almost identical backgrounds as far as the technology we grew up with, how we learned, how we've done our work, how we studied in school, yet she and I are considered different generations. So we think about this, the nonlinear life trajectory is totally changing the way we view everything. The traditional way that we looked at demographics on an age spectrum, for example, are completely out of whack. So we have to think about that in time space. Another area of time space is an idea that we call templosion. Templosion basically means the implosion of really big things into small amounts of time. So examples of that. Right now, from birth to death, a Fortune 500 company or a Fortune 500 sized company might only exist for 10 to 15 years. That's never been the case before. It used to be that really large companies took a while to grow, and then they were established, and then they stayed put for a long time. But we are seeing huge companies born and die within a generation. We are seeing startups staffed by only a few people and really skilled entrepreneurs attracting billions of dollars and growing to insane levels overnight. The average tenure of CEOs at American companies is precipitously declining year over year, and more people are actually now stating that they would rather pursue an entrepreneurial path than climb the ranks at a large company and become CEO because they don't want to put in the time and effort it takes to actually make it there. Flow, the idea that it takes about 10,000 hours to perfect a skill, such as playing guitar, is now even in jeopardy because researchers at DARPA are figuring out how to manipulate the brain so we can hack it and have people master a skill much more quickly. So that even changes the whole paradigm of taking time to learn a skill or a hobby. And then obviously people are hacking everything. They're figuring out shortcuts for getting an education, for moving their way up the corporate ladder, and for doing all sorts of things. Time space also has a profound effect on language. It used to be thought that the more sophisticated a culture or society was, the more sophisticated the written and spoken language of that society would become. And we've been on that trajectory for a long time. And the best examples of that a few centuries ago were the works of William Shakespeare, and obviously a lot of related works over the last few centuries, War and Peace, and all of these examples of dense, sophisticated language. Well, we entered the digital age and we moved to blogging. That didn't last very long. Then we went to microblogging. And we're restrained to a couple of hundred characters on microblogging, and now that even takes too much time for some people. We've moved to communicating via imagery. And the old adage that a picture tells 1,000 words, well, people now are communicating primarily through things like Pinterest or Instagram, or more fundamentally now, the millennial population, they are using Snapchat. They are basically communicating using image as language. So you think about how time space is completely redefining language and communication. And finally, time space has a major, major role to play in what's called the collaborative economy, or what we call collaborative consumption. So when you think about Airbnb or Lyft or Uber or Zipcar or Rent the Runway, any of these companies that have been built on this collaborative sharing kind of economy, it's all based on time. It's the optimization of the time value of an asset. So time-space is probably, if not the one of the most critical growth areas for anyone, irrespective of audience, but certainly for all of you. The second growth area is all about what makes living things tick. So living things encompasses people, animals, plants, but for our purposes today, we're just going to talk about the human brain. And this is called Interspace. And again, this was unintended, but it's really interesting that we're coming up against Jeremy's presentation just now about all of the processes that sort of take place in our mind and in our brain. Interspace is really interesting. There has been this tension for a long time, particularly in the research community, about how do we uphold the scientific standards, the strict scientific standards of research science, so that it maintains its integrity while going into these new frontiers of research. And the idea that apparatus-based brain research using EEG or fMRI, right now there are cost impediments to us being able to achieve, for example, huge, robust sample sizes when using brain research. Yes, that's an impediment. But I will tell you this, and another impediment is the whole concern that there are privacy implications here. Looking into someone's brain and seeing what they're actually thinking, seeing what's lighting up. But I will tell you this, that we started talking several years ago about brain research being the new frontier of market research, and a lot of people scoffed, but a few people raised their eyebrow and said, we're actually going to see if we can make a foray into this area. And now as I look back over the last 7 to 10 years, we have several blue chip companies out there that were pioneers in this area and have actually used brain research as a way, for example, to change where they want to put different items on a shelf in a retail display, or they change things around when creating or devising label architecture for a consumer product. This area of the brain lights up when we put this in blue instead of in red, when we make the item larger versus smaller, when we move it to the left or the right. These are things that people can't necessarily share consciously. And in some cases, people don't want to be forthcoming consciously. So a lot of the pitfalls of traditional self-reporting research, we get to navigate around by using some of the cutting-edge techniques in brain research. Now, is it foolproof today? Absolutely not. But as this technology starts to get a little bit more inexpensive over the years, a little bit more commoditized, this is going to be a fully accepted practice. So brain research is really critical. And it's interesting because brain research is also proving out differences in major demographic groups that we look at in market research today. So the most basic one to look at, and sometimes what people find controversial, are brain differences between men and women. And a lot of people to this day want to refute what we're actually finding in scientific research because they think it feeds into stereotypes, but it's true. The male brain on average is more specialized. The female brain on average is more integrated. And we are now finding out that because of the influence of hormones and neurotransmitters, men and women fundamentally, largely because of testosterone, make different financial decisions and have different risk appetites. So for example, to steal Jane McGonigal's term from yesterday, if a man makes a decision running an organization or makes a big financial decision and gets an epic win or an epic fail or loss out of that decision, it goes really well or really poorly, that man is likelier to make the same decision again. It's the same apparatus that is involved in gambling and why people get addicted to gambling. A woman, on the other hand, on average, is not as likely to make that decision again, nor is she as likely to make that decision in the first place. So there is a school of thought that says, well, look at all the banks and a lot of the financial institutions that played a role in what's happened to the economy over the last few years. An inordinate amount of their leadership was male. What would happen if we were to balance that and have a little bit more of a balance between male decision-making and female decision-making? It would probably be optimal. We probably want a little bit of this risk-taking, but on the other hand, we need a counterforce to mitigate that. So Interspace is critical. The third one is very basic, and it's about design. And it's not just about design as a lot of people think about it instinctively, which is the design of a product. It's about the design of products, services, environments, built environments, workplaces, retail stores, customer-facing protocols, you name it. This is design space. And it used to be that people who were really good at design were considered like the weird ones. They're creative, they're probably on something. We're putting them in a building off to the left, and every once in a while we'll call them up when we need something sort of figured out. What we see today is that design thinking is being considered one of the most critical components to leadership. So cross-industry, people who have design thinking capabilities are ascending the leadership ranks. Design is critical, and in your world, it's extremely critical. The design of survey mechanisms is increasingly important. And think about how design has impacted the output of research. Think about all of the techniques for data visualization and what's happening with infographics. That's all rooted in design. It's all the idea that how can we take all of this complex information, these zeros and ones, and present it and design it in a way that it actually becomes compelling. The fourth one is going to harken back a lot to last night's keynote, and this is called PlaySpace, and it has two fundamental components. The first, literally, is the concept of adult play. So adult play, this is something that's been coached out of all of us from the time we were kids. You know, you're told after a certain age, okay, all right, maybe it's before college, maybe it's after you graduate college. All right, the fun stuff is over. It's time for you to act like an adult. You're going to go get a job. You're going to stop playing around. You're going to stop climbing trees. You're going to stop running, you know, doing all of these little things that you do instinctively as a child, and now you're going to behave like an adult. Well, the problem with that is that even as adults, we have an inborn instinct to play. It's part of our DNA. It's who we are. So we are now learning that adults need to play. They need an outlet, and there are services being built around this. The most basic one, video games, gaming platforms. Jane McGonigal talked about it yesterday. Adults can play video games and be productive, and it's actually an outlet for them. It's a way for them to release these pent-up emotions and feelings. And they're actually building physical adult playgrounds in cities around the world. So these are actually, they look like art installations, but you actually have adults who are encouraged to climb through these art installations and use them as like a jungle gym. It's sort of like a jungle gym for adults. And we're seeing these pop up more and more. The second component to PlaySpace is gamification. Now, this is not gaming. It's gamification, the definition of which is applying game or gaming mechanics in a traditionally non-game or more serious setting. So the government right now uses a lot of gamification and crowdsourcing techniques, for example, to help try to figure out ways to solve problems, solve energy problems, solve infrastructure problems. Gamification is going to underpin everything. And it is a way to incent participation in research, to make research more fun. How do you use gamification, which, by the way, it may sound cliche, and most of you probably hear the term gamification thrown around constantly. It is going to underpin everything. Understand that. It has long been the purview of marketers to use rewards, loyalty programs, frequent flyer miles, all of that. That is a form of gamification, and marketers have long understood that, but now it is the purview of everyone, including researchers. The fifth area is all about storage. This is storage space. And the personal storage business has been booming for several decades now. It's still growing. It's also about the storage of waste. It's about the storage of e-waste, which has become a major global issue because a lot of the Earth's e-waste and garbage gets sent to China, an issue over there, and then it gets repackaged and put into other products like toys or medicines, and then it gets shipped back over here, and that's a big issue. And of course, it's the storage of information in our own brains, and more fundamentally for all of you, it's the storage of data. So up until a few years ago, scientists thought it was almost impossible that we would ever see the day when we would actually have a yottabyte of information or data on the Earth. And I think a yottabyte, and again, I'm not exactly sure about this, is equivalent to 1 septillion bytes of information, which based on current storage methods would require a facility as big as Delaware and Rhode Island combined to be able to store all of that data. Well, we are not far from being in what we call the yottasphere, where there will be so much data that there will be over a yottabyte of it. And where are we going to store that information? Well, there are experiments taking place right now in holographic data storage, quartz data storage, and even storing data on DNA. And they're just starting to begin to make a foray into that. So that's really interesting. Last year, we came across a study that suggested that the United States alone, United States businesses, are currently underserved by 1.5 million qualified data analysts to handle all of the information coming in. And information and data is coming in not in a linear growth pattern, but an exponential growth pattern. So if we are already at a shortage of 1.5 million qualified data analysts, human data analysts, what's that going to look like in a few years? Storage space. The sixth growth area is what we call cyberspace. This isn't just about the internet, and it's not just about apps. But there are three fundamental areas I'm going to run through very quickly for you. The first is virtual reality. I've already covered some of that, and it is the increased proliferation of virtual environments, whether it is online games, environments like Second Life or Entropia Universe or any of these. And it's interesting because virtual environments for a long time have already been used as places to test products, for example. So we had some marketers who were very forward-thinking who, in the advent of Second Life, 10 years ago were on here introducing virtual products to gauge what consumer response would be. And certainly if you want to look at how a package would appear in the real world, or a garment of clothing, you can run virtual testing in these sorts of environments. So virtual reality is very big. The second component of cyberspace is augmented reality. So instead of it being an alternative to our physical three-dimensional environment, these are tools that augment our three-dimensional physical environment, of which Google Glass is probably the most prominent example today. But of course, any wearable technology, and there are huge advancements being made in wearable technology, falls into this category. And the final component of cyberspace, which we love to talk about in our shop, is what's happening in the world of virtual digital cryptocurrencies. So again, just yell out. How many of you are familiar with or have heard about Bitcoin? Okay. So Bitcoin had its roots in very illicit businesses. It started as a way for untraceable currency trading cross-border in businesses like weapons and drugs and all sorts of really bad things. And then it mainstreamed. And now there are retail establishments that actually are accepting Bitcoin as a legitimate form of payment. But we said a few years ago, when Bitcoin started becoming really mainstream, that it was really just going to be the beta for this kind of currency, just like Friendster was for social media. And that within a few years, we were going to see at least one, maybe more upgraded versions of Bitcoin. And we're already seeing that. There's now something called Litecoin, which is coming out. And a lot of investors who couldn't get in on Bitcoin are now trying to get in on that. So this is all cyberspace. The seventh is what we call Interspace, and it is about engineers, designers, and architects using the actual architecture of the internet as inspiration for designing whole new nets or grids. Examples of this include the MatterNet, which uses the packet switching model of the internet as inspiration for actually dropping off packages or aid to underserved areas in the world. So because drones can't go very far distances on their own, this technology uses drones that go to switching stations, drop off a package to another drone, and that continues to happen until medicine or food reaches the intended target somewhere, again, that's very underserved in a remote area. The GridNet, for example, is how utilities and electric companies are trying to figure out how to optimize what they offer by using the architecture of the internet. And the most profound example of this is what's called the Internet of Things, which many of you have probably heard about. And that is the idea that starting now and in the future, everything will talk to everything else. It's already happening. The smart home is probably the most practical example of what we're seeing develop now that plays into this. The eighth is outer space. And that encompasses everything from space exploration and space tourism, with which Richard Branson is now making a reality, to terraforming and also asteroid mining. But most profoundly for all of you, it is the proliferation, the continued sophistication of satellite technology, GPS, and other geolocation and surveillance-based technologies, which are going to allow us to be even more efficient in the future at capturing real-time data. Number 9 can best be encapsulated by this crazy acronym. I know smoke will come out of your ears. Don't try to remember it. It is BANG Fuel, BAANGFUEL. Bits, atoms, antimatter, neurons, genes, frequencies, and ultra and infraspectral energy and light. That is a mouthful. And this is microspace. And microspace encompasses everything from nanotechnology to new materials technology and everything happening in 3D printing and additive manufacturing. The last growth area is what we call green to blue space. This is the continuum from doing green, which just about every business, as a cost of doing business, now has to do. We recycle, we try to be eco-friendly, yada, yada, yada. We participate in a green fundraiser. To being green, which is having as close to a net zero environmental impact as you possibly can, to being blue, which is the color of the earth, as seen from above. And being blue means to actually give more back to the natural environment or your ecosystem than you took. And that is very difficult, but we're starting to see that. So my time is running out. I have one last slide, and I want to leave you on this. This is a great quote. I find it very inspirational. And unlike Yogi Berra, this is from Henry Ford, who is one of the great pioneers of the last few centuries. And he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And I think this is really interesting for two reasons for this audience. One, most practically, it sort of talks about if you're really thinking about innovating, if you're on the brand side, for example, and you listen to what people tell you in self-reporting research, if you straight line extrapolate from that, you may just incrementally innovate. It may be very stepwise innovation because people will tell you they want faster horses. But more profoundly, what this really is about is the distinction between innovation and imagination. And in our shop, we tell all of our clients that innovation is a cliche, overused buzzword nowadays. Everyone says they innovate. But the people who are truly, quote unquote, innovative are imagining. They are reimagining the future. They are not imagining faster horses, they're imagining cars. So you're all in an industry which for decades had very little true innovation. And now a lot of you are innovating. I'm so encouraged by what I see in the exhibition hall and what I've heard from talking to people. You are innovating along with the pace of technological change, but some of you are going to be ahead of that curve. You're going to be more proactive than reactive. So I task all of you in this room with everything I've taught you today about the 10 growth areas and the recognition of educated incapacity. Leave here thinking more about how you can imagine and reimagine versus innovating. That's 30 minutes on the future. I hope you enjoyed. I am standing in between hundreds of people and alcohol. I know that that's not an enviable position to be in, so thank you for your patience and enjoy.